Thank you very much for coming on this evening. You might ask, why Lieutenant General Sir John Moore? What is special about him? Well, when we think of the Napoleonic Wars, we think of Nelson, obviously, from the Navy, and Wellington for the Army. But when Sir Arthur Wellesley, as he was at the time, returned from India, it was 1805, and the Napoleonic Wars had been on the go for approximately 10 years. And it was the actions of John Moore that preserved our very small professional army of only about 40,000 men that formed the nucleus of the force that Wellington was then able to take in for the Peninsular War. But in fact, the story of John Moore is much more interesting than just that and goes back further. I'm just trying to, sorry, I'll advance. Next slide. John Moore was born in Glasgow in November 1761. His father, the Reverend Dr. John Moore, is on the left on this photograph, on the painting on the right, was a military surgeon who'd served under Colonel Campbell, the future Duke of Argyll, in the War of Austrian Succession. When he returned to Glasgow after this war, he took up the role of physician to the children of the Dowager Duchess of Hamilton. This gave him the patronage of the two most powerful ducal families in Scotland. The new Duke, Douglas, the 8th Duke of Hamilton, was only 16 years of age at this time, and his mother, the Dowager Duchess, decided, in conjunction with the Duke of Argyll, who was Colonel Campbell, to send Douglas on a grand tour of Europe. And they thought that Dr. John Moore was an ideal man to act as the tutor and guide him around Europe, and that young John Moore could accompany Douglas as a friend and a companion. They left on a grand tour of Europe with Dr. Moore as the tutor in 1772 and headed first for Paris. But they didn't stay there very long because Douglas, being probably the most eligible bachelor in Europe, was attracting the attention of the French courtesans. So they moved rapidly on to Geneva. And it was here that young John Moore decided that his career should be directed towards the military, and his education was pushed in this direction. After a period of time in Switzerland, they moved north through the German states and up to Prussia. And being associated with the senior Scottish Duke gave young John access to the senior heads of state of Europe, including Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Emperor. They were so impressed by young John that, in fact, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor offered young John a commission in his personal guard, which John was able to turn down politely, largely on the basis he was only about 12 years of age. They moved on to Italy, and then on their return to Scotland, young John realized and was informed that the Duke of Argyll had secured for him the post of ensign in 1776 on the 51st Regiment of Foot, which was serving in Minorca. And this was the junior rank in the army at that time. So he was very excited about this and was just 15 years of age when he took up this post in Minorca in 1776. Now, this was an interesting time because we were in the American War of Independence. And the Duke of Hamilton, in great patriotic fervor, decided at his own expense to raise a regiment of foot, the 82nd Regiment. He decided, however, that he was not going to command this. He was going to have professional officers. But being a true Scot, he wanted to keep a close eye on the money and insisted, and it was agreed by the Prime Minister at the time, that John Moore, young John Moore, could be promoted to the rank of lieutenant and given the post of quartermaster to look after that aspect of the regiment. After a period of initial training in Scotland, the regiment transferred to Halifax in Nova Scotia, and then on to, as can be seen in the top right-hand side, Penobscot Bay, which is in Maine. And the British had decided, in order to secure themselves against the colonists, that they would develop a base here to threaten the main rebel base in Boston. The Americans discovered this and were obviously concerned, and they put together a force of 19 warships and over 3,000 men to go and displace the British from their base in Penobscot Bay. And we can see in the bottom right on the diagram where the American forces in blue came, and they attempted to land near the British fort. They were actually quite unsuccessful in doing this, and there was a lot of courage shown by the British troops, even though they were significantly outnumbered by the Americans. And it was at this time that young John Moore demonstrated initially his great leadership and courage. And leading small groups of men, he was able to stop the Americans landing until they took 3 frigates that sailed along the coast and bombarded the beach, enabling the Americans to land. The Americans then attacked the British fort with overwhelming numbers in both cannon and men, but for 3 weeks the British held out until a fleet of ships, as shown below, which included 1 ship of the line, sailed into Penobscot Bay and either sank, captured, or drove aground all the American warships. And out of a force of many thousand, only 200 to 300 Americans managed to make it back to Boston overland. This destruction of an American fleet by the British was the biggest defeat the American Navy suffered up to the time of Pearl Harbor. Young John stayed there while the British developed the base, and then was in New York at the time of the surrender of the British in North America after the Battle of Yorktown. He returned a half-pay captain to Glasgow without an obvious career at this time, but his great friend, the Duke of Hamilton, decided to suggest to him that he should take up a career in politics. A general election was taking place in 1784, and we are in an era when there were such things as rotten boroughs. And the Duke of Hamilton offered young John the borough and the seat of Lanarkburg, to which he was duly elected. I'm not sure how many people voted for him, but he was elected in 1784. But John Moore agreed to take this on only on the condition that he could act as an independent MP and was not merely going to be a mouthpiece for the Duke. And the Duke was very happy to accede to this. So John went down to London to Parliament, and he was extremely impressed, as I'm sure most people were at that time, by the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. And William Pitt the Younger was also very impressed by young John. But even though he enjoyed Parliament, he realized that his main interest in his career was in the army. He wanted to go back, and in 1787, he was promoted to the rank of major and put in charge of training at Chatham Army Base. Training was one of the great successes of John Moore, and all the regiments that passed through him in training were graded as excellent. In 1788, he returned to his original regiment to which he was appointed, the 51st Regiment, that was stationed in Cork in Ireland. Unfortunately, he found the regiment in a very poor state. The lieutenant colonel was negligent of his duties and not interested, and several of the officers were drunk and treated the men under them brutally. Fortunately for John, the lieutenant colonel surrendered his colonelcy, and John was able to purchase it, probably with some help from Douglas, the Duke of Hamilton, and set about correcting the discipline and the fighting strength of the 51st Regiment, getting rid of the officers who had cruelly treated their men and promoting younger officers into their roles. And this emphasized the attitude of John Moore in that he insisted that everyone from the lowest soldier to the highest officer should be treated equally and with respect. Over the next few years, he really brought the 51st Regiment up to standard. We now come to the beginnings of the Napoleonic War. In mid-1793, John's regiment was allocated to go to take on garrison duties at Gibraltar. At this time, there was conflict between the Republicans in France and the remaining King's forces, and this particularly centered around the port of Toulon. The decision of the British government was to transfer John's regiment to support the French royalists in Toulon, but bad weather delayed their arrival, and Toulon had fallen before John Moore and his troops could arrive. The French general at that time who captured Toulon was a young French general called Napoleon Bonaparte. As a result of not taking part in the attack on and the defense of Toulon, John Moore's regiment were diverted to Corsica. Now, Corsica had only recently become a French possession, having been Genoese. And there was a lot of conflict in the Corsicans themselves, who weren't that keen on the French rule. The British wanted to secure the Bay of Martello, and this is where the tower and the ruined tower comes into play. This tower had resisted attack by 3 British ships of the line, but the British needed to capture it so that they could secure this as a safe anchorage for their ships. John Moore landed with his troops, and to capture the fort, succeeded in winching up cannon up on top of a cliff so they could fire onto it from above, capturing the fort. He then proceeded across Corsica to Bastia, which is the main city on the eastern side of Corsica, where he took part in the siege of Bastia. And this is where he first met Horatio Nelson, who was in charge of the gunnery in the bastions attacking Bastia. After 2 weeks of bombardment, the French surrendered in Bastia, leaving only Calvi as a French outpost on Corsica. John Moore, true to form, was sent to capture this with 500 men, supported again by Nelson in the Agamemnon. Bombardment from sea wasn't practical for the capture of Calvi, so Nelson commanded the guns on shore, and it was at this time, while fighting with Moore and in command of the guns, that a cannonball landed nearby, showering stone and other debris, which blinded Nelson in the right eye. Moore, leading his men from the front, as he always did, succeeded in capturing Calvi, although Moore was knocked unconscious during the attack itself. With a successful capture of Calvi, General Paoli, who was the really de facto head of the Corsicans themselves, who was a great Anglophile, proposed that Corsica would join Great Britain in formal union. What a wonderful opportunity that would have been if the British had taken it. However, they sent entirely the wrong person, a chap called Gilbert Elliot, to be the viceroy, and he treated Paoli and the native Corsicans who were pro-British with contempt, promoting people who were more interested in making money. Moore and his commanding general, General Stuart, were so disgusted by this, they left Corsica, and General Paoli left shortly afterwards, coming to Britain. And the Corsicans themselves realized that they would be better off under the French than the British. And the British were forced shortly after to evacuate Corsica and return to Gibraltar. What a potential loss that was. Moore returned to England, but wasn't there for long. We next go to 1776, and the British decided it was time to capture the French islands in the Caribbean, the French Antilles. Moore was given, given the rank of brevet, which was a temporary promotion, brigadier, was given command of the forces to capture St. Lucia. This force that was given was 5,000 men, but it was interesting that a quarter of these were the Black West Indian Regiment. This was formed of freed slaves who were very efficient fighters and, equally important, had resistance to infection, because operating in the West Indies had a high mortality of certainly European troops due to infection. They landed north of the port of Castries and had to pull their cannon through thick jungle and over several mountain hills to face the main fort, Fort Montfortune, protecting Castries. This was a pretty brutal battle to capture it, because it was defended, interestingly, by French West Indian troops who were freed slaves, freed by the revolution. But eventually, with the Inniskillen Fusiliers, Fort Montfortune was captured. But Moore typically insisted that all the prisoners were treated the same and treated fairly. which certainly reduced the problems that he would otherwise have faced. After this, More was given the position of governor and commandant of St. Lucia. And with peace restored, the plantation owners returned and started to mistreat their slaves. More would have absolutely none of this. He declared martial law and insisted that all people on the island, whether they were slaves or free, were treated equally and fairly and without any brutality, which was again a feature of his life. In May 1797, he developed a large abscess on his leg. This was treated initially with Peruvian bark or from the cinchona tree, from which quinine was subsequently purified in 1820. But he was so ill and deteriorating that he was evacuated to Guadeloupe, where a surgeon incised the abscess, draining the pus, and he returned back to England to complete his recovery. He's not idle for long, John More, and as soon as he'd recover from this, his next port of call was back to Ireland, where he'd originally been with his regiment, the 51st Regiment of Foot. Now, 1797, and particularly towards the end of this, had led to major insurrections in Ireland, led by Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen, supported, of course, by the French, although their landings in Ireland tended to be frustrated by bad weather and also the Royal Navy. More was absolutely appalled by the treatment of the peasants in Ireland by the large landowners. He was commented as saying they were treated worse than the slaves in the West Indies. And in the parts of Ireland in which he was in command, he was very strict at prohibiting brutality. But brutality was a feature on both sides in this war, both the Irish peasants and fighting for independence and their landowners. He was not present at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which was the decisive battle to defeat the United Irishmen, but fought in the Battle of Foulkes Mill and the relief of Wexford, preventing any massacres. He refused, however, to stay on in Ireland and to act in any role as governor. After returning and back to his regiment and continuing at this time with training, we now move on to 1799. At this time, More had made the increase in rank from colonel to major general. The British were very concerned at this time that the French did not get access to the Dutch fleet, which was very high quality ships based in the Texel and the Helder. The French republicanism had taken root to a degree in Holland at this time, and there were French troops in Holland at this time. But the British decided to secure the French fleet, that they would land a force of British with some Russian help, which is interesting as to what the Russians were doing in Holland at that time, near the main base at Texel and the Helder, which they did. And that is shown on the painting on the right-hand side of this slide. They started to attack the forts, and for 24 hours, the Dutch resisted very strongly. But the following day, the Dutch appeared to have completely disappeared, and the British were able to go forward and capture the Dutch fleet, which was the main reason for the attack. This having happened, More and his troops were withdrawn and moved up the coast to try and take part in the capture of Amsterdam. And it was this time they realized the difficulty of fighting in the topography of Holland with its dikes and canals. And it was complicated by the fact that not only were the French troops there fighting very well, but that the Dutch were not quite so keen on the return of the House of Orange at this time, and not so keen on fighting against the French. And it soon became apparent that a stalemate had ensued. More, as usual in his regiment, was at the front of the line fighting them, and More at the front of his own troops. It was while fighting there and leading a controlled retreat back to the coast that he was shot in the face with a bullet narrowly missing his right eye and emerging just above his right ear and not going into his brain. And it's very important to see this comment by the Duke of York, who was the Commander-in-Chief of British forces, that his conduct in the serious action of the 2nd of October has raised him, if possible, higher than he stood before in the estimation of the army. The best general in the British service, and this is a universal opinion. And, you know, that's an amazing compliment played to him by the commander-in-chief, and it showed the great feeling that people had of Moore and his generalship. Following this period of time, Moore was based largely in the Mediterranean. He was commander in the British forces in Minorca, which was a British province, a British territory at that time. He was fortunate in 1800 that when some troops and forces under him were set on attacking Cadiz, bad weather prevented them landing, because at this time Cadiz was rampant with plague. In 1803, however, the British decided they needed to do something about Egypt. But surely that had been sorted by Nelson at the Battle of the Nile on the 1st of August, 1798. But at that time, Napoleon and 30,000 French had landed in Egypt. And although at the Battle of the Nile, the French fleet had been destroyed, the French troops were still there, and they had succeeded in conquering Egypt, and in fact had moved up into Palestine, where they were only stopped by the British at the Battle of Acre. But when it came to 1803, the British decided that they should be removed from Egypt because of the risk and their problem on the route to India. General Moore was second in command of the British troops that landed in Abu Qir Bay at the site of the Battle of the Nile. They got onto the beach and had to take the French defenses by storm because the cannons had not been landed, and then moved on the main French base in that part of Egypt at Alexandria. The British were based in the old Roman city, just outside Alexandria, which is the lower picture on this side, and bloody battles with cavalry and infantry took place as the British surrounded and isolated Alexandria. And at this time, Moore was shot in the left leg, but recovered at Rosetta. It took 2 to 3 months for this to happen. Unfortunately, he didn't get infection, which was not the case for the senior general, who was also shot in the leg at a similar time to Moore and died of gangrene as a result of his bullet injury. Having safely isolated Alexandria, the British decided to advance down the Nile to Cairo in July to capture and defeat the French. And this was achieved by supreme logistics of supplying the troops marching down the Nile from the Nile itself with food and ammunition. When they arrived at Cairo, they surrounded the French, who surrendered, and the British under Moore escorted them back to the coast, where they were allowed to evacuate with their arms back to France, but had to leave the antiquities they had found behind. And that is how the Rosetta Stone, which is at the top, is in the British Museum and not in the Louvre. Moore was offered the post of governor of Egypt, declined, and returned to Britain in November. Now, this was a time of when Britain was at fear of invasion by Napoleon. He was across the Channel in Boulogne. Moore again was put in charge of training, and it was here his genius at training light infantry came to the fore. He was firm but fair, and the infantry training manuals that he devised at this time are still used by the light infantry in the British Army. And it is John Moore Barracks at Folkestone that is still present now and is a major home of the light infantry. In 1804, he was made a KB, a Knight of the Bath, and promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and put in charge of defending the coast from Dover through to Hastings. Now, at the top, we see a Martello Tower, and any of us that have been on the New Romney, Dymchurch and Hythe will be very aware of these towers that are still present on the coast. And these were built under the instruction of Moore, because he was so impressed by the tower at Martello Point in Corsica that had resisted 3 ships of the line trying to bombard them, and they were built to defend them. And he also arranged for the construction of the Royal Military Canal. Now, the defeat of the French and Spanish Navy at Trafalgar had given Britain command of the sea. And in 1806, the British decided to take over Sicily and make it a second Gibraltar. Sicily was still ruled by the king and queen of Naples and the 2 Sicilies, and the French, and I gather the Queen at that time was very manipulative. More didn't have a very big force there in which to utilize, and he was confounded in the aims, by conflicting instructions from London, and also the changing alliances between Prussia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. And it led to the position being impossible. And the British eventually abandoned Sicily, going back to Gibraltar. It's at this time that the only love interest comes to the fore, in that More fell in love with Caroline Fox, who was the daughter of the general in charge at Sicily. But he decided the age difference was too much, and he didn't want to get killed and create a widow. And she was quite heartbroken for a while, but subsequently married. But this girl was no ordinary person. She was brilliant and broke the Napoleon's military code, so that Wellington was subsequently able to read the military commands of Napoleon. And Wellington said that she contributed more to his victory than any other individual in Britain. 1808, Britain is alone. The French have conquered all of the northern Europe, and the only ally we have is Sweden. And at this time, Sweden is involved in war with Russia for control of what was then called the Eastern Sweden province, but we would now call Finland. The British decided that they needed to support the Swedish king, who was a very eccentric individual, some people would say rather mad, and More set sail with 10,000 men to go to Gothenburg, but with conflicting orders. The King of England, King George, wished to support his fellow monarch, but the politicians, the last thing they wanted was to get a significant part of their small professional army involved in a land war. And More was in the middle trying to sort things out. And this was a time when the Swedish king was getting even more erratic, but More managed to escape and the British to evacuate from Sweden without actually having landed. Russia eventually defeated the Swedes in this war, and Eastern Sweden was taken over by Russia and became the Grand Duchy of Finland. 1808 is now the time when we read to think of the peninsula. And just a brief summary of things there is that there was a very fractious relationship between Spain and France. At times they'd been allies at the time of Trafalgar, but the Spanish were pretty unhappy at the fact that they'd lost their fleet at that. The French were increasingly taking control, and Napoleon had made his brother the King of Spain. The French invaded Portugal to try and capture the Portuguese fleet, small but very high quality ships. But they managed to escape with the Portuguese royal family to Brazil. And Portugal, remember, is our oldest ally. It's the only country in Europe we've never been to war with. The British government decides at this time that Lisbon should be recaptured and Portugal freed. Now, everybody expected More to be made the commanding general. He was the senior general who had any experience in fighting and had been very successful. But the politicians, Castlereagh and Canning, were very upset because of, and blamed More for the debacle in Sweden. So they gave command to two rather senile and geriatric generals who hadn't fought anything for several decades, but put Wellesley and More under their command. And Wellesley was very upset about this because he'd come back from India, where he'd made his name, and fully expected and wanted to be placed under the brilliant command of More. The British had a force that set off to land in Portugal, and it's important to remember that More had been stuck with his 10,000 men in Sweden, and these men had never got off the ship, so they weren't at their fittest. But in August 1808, Wellesley, just before More had arrived there, landed at the Mondego River and managed to defeat Marshal Junot at Rolica, as seen on the painting on the right-hand side, and then subsequently again at Wimmera. The two rather geriatric generals arrived and claimed, of course, the benefit and having secured this great victory. And they and Wellesley agreed with the French the Convention of Sintra, by which the French army agreed to evacuate from Portugal with all their arms back to France, and leaving Lisbon and at that time part of Portugal under British control. That didn't go down too well in London. Moore certainly was not going to sign this and refused. And quite a lot of criticism came on the generals that had done this, although they secured Portugal without a great loss of life. And in fact, Marshal Junot had more forces at that time than Wellesley had. Moore finally landed with his men on the 24th of August and met Wellesley for the only time they actually met personally. And Wellesley was incredibly impressed by Moore and thought everything he'd heard about him was true. And he agreed that he would return to England and use all his support, because remember, his brother had been the Viceroy of India and was a senior member of the aristocracy. And Wellesley said he would return to England, support and insist on Moore being given command of the army in Portugal, which happened on the 25th of September. Now, Moore now found himself in Spain, in Lisbon, with 30,000 men, cavalry and artillery, plus a further force of 10,000 men under General Baird in Corunna. However, he was in a bit of a pickle because he had very little intelligence, he had no accurate maps, and even more important, no money to buy supplies. He decided that he would advance from Lisbon up through Portugal into Salamanca. This would give him the opportunity to either advance to Madrid or to move north into the Galician plains and the plains of Castile and attack the French lines of communication. He had to split his forces to get there, with the infantry passing directly through Ciudad Rodrigo to Salamanca, but the artillery and the cavalry having to go a more indirect route through Badajoz, Alcantara to reach Salamanca. And the infantry arrived first, joined by the cavalry artillery on the 4th of December. But as I mentioned, the intelligence was poor. He couldn't reckon whether Madrid had fallen to the French. Where was Napoleon? How many men were in Spain? The figure that was quoted to Moore was it was approximately 80,000 men. But the problem was that the information that came from the Spanish junta went to London and then from London to Moore, and one can imagine the length of time that took to arrive. Moore had to make a decision. Did he just retreat back into Portugal, or did he go on the offensive? And Moore was never the man to just retreat if he could do some harm to the enemy. So he decided that the best plan was to move northeast to attack Marshal Soult before retreating, rather than to Portugal, to Corunna. He was unaware at this time, however, that Napoleon had captured Madrid, and he wasn't there with 80,000 men. He was there with the entire Grand Army of 250,000 men and the Imperial Guard. In December, Moore found himself in Sahagun, which was northeast of Salamanca, when a French courier was captured, and he discovered that Napoleon had turned round at Talavera, had marched 200 miles in just over 10 days, and was chasing the British. In Napoleon's own words, Moore is the only general left in Europe worth my personal attention. And here you can see Napoleon leading his men 20 miles plus a day march. Quite incredible, an amazing man. Moore undertook a cavalry attack on Marshal Soult, and then decided that he would have to retreat via Astorgas and then on to Corunna. Moore brought his forces down south to Benavente because they had to cross the river Esla. At this point, Napoleon was less than 50 miles away and his cavalry a lot closer. Fortunately, Moore managed to arrive at a bridge across the river Esla at Benavente and cross the bridge with his forces, protected in the rear by the King's German Legion, just at the time when Napoleon arrived on the heights above. And here he is at the top looking down onto Moore as he sees that the British have got their whole army across. He sends some cavalry who try to attack them but are defeated. And he realizes that Moore will blow the bridge and he'll now no longer be able to capture him. He didn't want the indignity of losing the battle, so he left to Marshals Ney and Soult. The bridge was blown, giving them a 48-hour start. But during this time on this retreat, was protected by General Romana, who was a very loyal Spanish general who fought with Moore through this time. When Moore arrived in Astorgas here, he decided to split his forces, sending General Crawford and the Spanish under Romana through to Vigo, while he retreated through the passes of Cacabelas, Manizal, and then finally Los Nogales. Now, this doesn't sound much, but the last pass at Los Nogales near Lugo here is 6,000 feet up. This was December, this was winter, this was snow and ice. The British rapidly left Astorgas, heading through to Cacabelos, where they, with the French in hot pursuit. And as I said, General Marshal Soult arrived less than a day behind Moore at Astorgas. So this was a race for time. The retreat through the passes showed great courage, not just with the British, with the cavalry under Lord Paget and the rifles protecting the rear guard, most of the cavalry going ahead to try and secure the passes, but also great courage and fortitude by the French pursuing them, who slightly outnumbered the British about 1.5 to 1. And these pectines here show the retreating infantry going up through. And problems arose at this time with discipline, because food was scarce, but it seemed that when they were going through the villages in the town, alcohol was not scarce. And a lot of the British troops at this time were getting progressively drunk. They were just left behind and usually slaughtered by the French dragoons coming back. Moore had to use some pretty hard discipline to get his men forward. It was interesting that when they came to the last pass, which is on the black and white photograph on the left at Los Nogales, they got supplies and finally money. During his time in Spain, Moore had been very grateful for the local Spanish who supplied him with supplies and money, but suddenly barrels of silver coin appeared. Moore didn't want his men lumbered by this and insisted they were thrown into the gorge below, much to the consternation of the troops. But you can see from this picture just how narrow the gorges were that the British troops were having to retreat through to get towards La Corona, 6,000 feet up in snow. Eventually, after a standoff at Lugo, they managed to cross the river Burgos and get into Corona. But when they arrived, there was no sign of the fleet. The English fleet at that time that was coming to evacuate them was stuck trying to get round Cape Finisterre by storms. But they crossed the river, destroyed the bridge, and were able for a period of time to buy themselves 2 to 3 days where they were able to rest and rearm. But Moore realized when he eventually saw after 3 days the fleet coming into harbor that he would have to fight a battle. The French by this time had crossed the river higher up and had brought their forces, which I say outnumbered the British forces, across with their artillery on the high ground facing the British. The Battle of Corunna took place on the 16th of January, 1809. And this was a defensive battle that Moore had to fight while at the same time evacuating his wounded and troops slowly to the ships. It was a bloody battle. It was helped by the cavalry of Paget and the great courage of the Guards and the Highlanders who fought in Elvira in the center of the line, where you see General Baird was the general in charge. When it got to the evening, Marshal Ney realized that he couldn't physically defeat the British and withdrew in the evening the French forces back. Now, about the battle and General Moore, Moore was conspicuous throughout this leading from the front. It was something he did throughout his career and something all the great generals did at this time. They were conspicuous because their men knew if they could see their general and he was taking the same risks as them, they would expose themselves to risks. During the battle, a French gunnery commander realized that there were times when groups of officers would meet by a rocky pinnacle. So he trained 2 cannon on this pinnacle. And when he saw a collection of officers there, he fired his cannon at them. And as chance would have it, one of them hit Moore on the left shoulder, causing him serious mortal injuries. He was carried from the field back to the fortress of Corunna, but received reports all the way through and realized again that the Guards and the Highlanders had driven the French off for a last time. He died of blood loss at 8 o'clock, knowing that the battle had been won. Moore was quite specific. He said to his fellow generals that if I die in battle, I will not leave Spain. So that evening, as the troops were evacuating to the ships, they buried him in full dress uniform under the ramparts of Corunna. And the Galicians, true to their word, agreed that they would carry on bombarding the French troops from their ramparts to keep them away to allow the British to evacuate. And this would not have been at risk to them because there would have been fear that the French would take severe reprisals of them after the British had left. But they were true to their word and bombarded, and the British were able to evacuate their fleet, their men and their army, the bulk of the British professional army of 40,000 men, back safely to Britain. After the battle, Marshal Soult found the grave of Moore and insisted that a plaque was raised above the grave to celebrate such a worthy adversary. Cannon and Castlereagh, who were no friend of Moore's, tried to ridicule and blame everything on Moore himself, but they were forced to backtrack and acknowledge Moore's heroic role, led largely by Hester Stanning, who was the niece of William Pitt. The French found holding Galicia very, very difficult because of the struggles from the Galicians themselves. And 2 years later, General Romana and the Galicians returned to Corunna, and Romana exhumed Moore's body and placed it in a tomb that could be seen on the top picture, which was overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and as it is, stands now in La Corunna, the tomb of Sir John Moore. The greatest compliment, I think, comes of General Moore, came that Napoleon himself. When he was writing from St. Helena, he said, I agree that it was only Moore's action which stopped me taking Spain and Portugal by lockjawing all of my planned movements, and I admire him for it. He prevented capture of Spain and Portugal. Now, when did I first hear about Moore? I heard about him at school, as I'm sure a lot of people did. And this is this wonderful poem that was written, The Burial of Sir John Moore After Corunna by Charles Wolfe. And this is a statue of Sir John Moore in Glasgow, where he was born. And this is the first and the last verse. And I'll just read them out. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note. As his course to the rampart we hurried. Not a soldier discharged his farewell shot, or the grave where our hero was buried. Slowly and sadly we laid him down from the field of his fame fresh and gory. We carved not a line and we raised not a stone, but we left him alone with his glory. He was, in my view, a true British hero who led by example with courage and compassion, the equal of any of our other heroes. And like my other great hero, Nelson, and also say General Wolfe, died leading their men at the front at the moment of their greatest triumph. Thank you very much. Goodness me. What even Steve Challiker? Oh, yes, he's got his hand up.
I better start off with a question, Bob. Thank you very much. I did not know almost anything about that amazing history. So thank you very much for that. I just wondered, going back out of Europe, back to St. Lucia.
Yeah.
I know, because I was reading recently again about James Barry, when he / she went out there, about the conditions that the troops were in, because the barracks were very low lying ground, full of malaria and so on. And he, Sir John Moore, sounds a very compassionate person, and I wonder whether there was any aspect like that of the caring for the troops. He clearly cared for his men, but I wonder whether that translated into the hygiene and all those other aspects that might make them safer.
I'm not aware particularly of hygiene, but what you say is he cared immensely. He cared for everybody, the enemy as much as his own troops, that he cared for them. You know, he would not allow slaves to be mistreated. He always insisted that the common man had every right to the same treatment as these officers and the aristocracy. But yes, it was the mortality of fighting in San Lucia, which is hard to imagine when you think of it as a beautiful Caribbean island, was very high, especially amongst the European troops. And this is why the Black West Indian troops that were fighting for the British was so important, because they had the resistance to the infection. And they fought for Moore because he treated them with respect. And they knew that by fighting for him in that, they were freed. And the reward for it was freedom. And that was the French black troops found the same thing, when he captured them. So, he did care for them because he knew that they were a very valuable resource.
Yeah, no, thank you.
It's interesting that he was treated with Peruvian bark, which people didn't realize was actually a definitive treatment for malaria, being actually quinine, and from what quinine was purified, but not till 1820.
Yeah, yeah.
Bob, I wanted to make a comment. I was fascinated. I was going to ask you the question about the Martello Towers, because of course they go up into Suffolk. And I had never realized that connection between Martello in Corsica, Martello Fort, and found that really interesting. And they've stood the test of time. They're all standing there still.
Well, apparently this tower withstood HMS Victory and 2 other ships of the line bombarded it and could make no impact on it. And the only way he succeeded was by getting his cannon onto the cliff above and firing down. And they had some straw on the roof, and they could set the straw alight and get it that way. They had to be taken from above, in effect, rather than by direct bombardment. But with that tower there, the British couldn't get their ships into that bay, which was a very safe anchorage. But yeah, he was so impressed by it. That was the design he was going to have when he was protecting the south coast.
Yeah, Sue, do unmute yourself.
I'm trying. Yes, got them. Thank you, Bob. That was fascinating. Howard has had to go off to another meeting, but asked me to ask a question which you actually answered, but he wanted to know if there are any statues to him. And obviously there's that one in Glasgow. Are there any others?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm sure there must be. That is a definitive one of him, because that was where he was born and brought up.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that,
but otherwise,
sure
thank you so much for reminding me of that fantastic poem. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note. I hadn't heard that since school days, and it was a great.
Well, that's where I picked it up. It was a very popular poem.
It was, yes.
When I was young. It was kind of patriotic. And I just think, he and Wolfe and Nelson, they epitomize what true military leadership was.
Yes, yes. Don't breed them like that anymore, do they?
No, they don't. Well, you get to the First World War and they couldn't be further back from the front line, really, could they?
No, thanks very much for that.
There was no over the top then, boys. It was, follow me.
Yeah.
I think what was interesting was Egypt. How I always used to think that when Nelson had defeated the French fleet at the Nile, that was it, and the French were defeated and went back. They weren't. They were sitting there conquering Egypt and going up into Palestine. It was only 4 years later or so when they were actually expelled.
And the nice note of how the Rosetta Stone came our way.
Yes, because the French had discovered it, but it would have been in the Louvre, much better in the British Museum.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I don't know if you can hear me there, can you?
Yes, I can hear you.
For that fascinating account. You said you remember more from school, but I can't say that I can. And I was wondering why he wasn't better known, or isn't better known at the moment. And one thing that crosses my mind was that his body did remain in Spain whilst it being brought back, like Nelson say, to London. He might have been more famous as a result.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably would have happened if he was buried in St. Paul's or alongside Nelson and other great heroes, I'm sure he would. I think that was what appealed to the Spanish so much, was that, and why he's a great hero. If you go to northwest Spain, I gather, he is, deified almost in his hero. But I think we don't know about him as much because the military side of the Napoleonic Wars is so dominated by Wellington. But that was only from just shortly after Moore, 1809, 1810, 1814. And nobody thinks any military campaigns went ahead before the Peninsular War.
Mm.
And it was dominated by Nelson and Wellington. Nelson in the first half, Wellington in the second half. But he was, without Moore, there would have been no British army. We had a very professional army. It was very good. But it was only 40,000 men strong, because the bulk of our force were in the Navy. And without that, if he hadn't got that army out, there would have been nothing for Wellington to take back, and there'd have been no Peninsular War. And the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars could therefore have been very different. Because if the Peninsular War hadn't happened, Napoleon probably would not have been defeated the first time round.
Who would Moore have learned his tactics from? Would
Well, he learned from
books
Stuart,
schools or
Baird, and some very good, generals at that time he served under. But I'm trying to just remember that the name of Clinton was the general he served under at Penobscot. He just had a natural ability, and I think it was because his men trusted him. He was never cruel or brutal to them, and he always insisted that the men be treated fairly, and that if you did that, they'd fight the better for it. And that's why his articles of training of light infantry are still used in the British Army now. I think he's not remembered as much, but he is in the British Army. If you go near the light infantry and you go down to Shore, down by Folkestone and the barracks there, it's also John Moore Barracks. So I think his training was one of his greatest gifts to the British Army.
I assume that Hamilton was the one that married, was Lady Hamilton, Nelson's lover. Is that the same Hamilton, Bob?
Hamilton from what thing, sorry?
Well, his friend Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton.
Oh, the Duke of Hamilton. No, nothing to do with Emma Hamilton. No, he married. He was the senior Duke of Douglas, Duke of Hamilton, senior Duke in Scotland. He was an incredibly wealthy Scottish landowner. No, married. No, nothing to do with Emma Hamilton. Was born in Chester.
Yeah,
from very poor background.
No, but I mean, she became the lover of the Duke of Hamilton.
Yeah, I don't know whether. Yes, sorry. Yes. Who was she married eventually? I don't know whether he was English. He was not Scottish.
Right.
He was a volcanologist, interestingly, as well, which made being in Naples, ambassador in Naples, very apposite if you're into volcanoes and antiquities. He loved Roman antiquities and volcanoes. So being near Pompeii and Herculaneum and Vesuvius was very appropriate. No, I don't think he was related to the Duke of Hamilton.
And did Sir John Moore, did he ever marry? Did he ever marry?
No, he never married.
Right.
He never married. There was rumors that he was Hester Stanhope, who was the niece of William Pitt the Younger. There was some question of whether she had an emotional attachment to him. But Caroline Fox, who was a brilliant girl, she was quite a lot younger than him. And Moore had made an agreement with his brother, Graham Moore, who was a Royal Naval captain, that neither would marry until the war was over, because they didn't want to create a young widow. So he never married. If he'd survived Corunna and come back, he might have married, because sometimes the men seem to marry older in those days when they'd made their mark.
So how old was he when he died?
1809, 1760. I'll have to do some maths.
1761 to 1809, did you say?
1861 yes, that's 40,
Okay.
39, 48. Seems
Not
to be a
so
common
old,
age,
is it?
because that's about the same age as Nelson,
Yeah.
who was 1858 to 1758 to 1805. It seemed to be a common age for people who, when they die, I suppose those that died in battle would die at their peak, and their mid-late 40s was about the time you were commander-in-chief.
Yeah. Seems very young now, doesn't it?
Certainly does.
Yeah.
Yes, I must remember that. Yeah,
Hmm.
I had to do some maths then.
So did he die a wealthy man? Did he make much money out of all his exploits?
I don't think he did, actually. I think, he got his salary and everything else. He was never into money because
No.
he lived in the army. He was part of the army. He never built he didn't build, say, for example, a big estate.
No.
Or, like Nelson went back and got Burnham Thorpe and built his house there. And then he had his palace. And Wellington, of course, had his place down in Somerset and everything. So no, he never did that. Whether if he survived and retired, how he would have retired and what into, I don't know. But he never